Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, I'm Sarthak, and I welcome you to one more episode of All Things Policy. In today's episode, we are going to discuss about ways, methods, benchmarks to do some public policy analysis. And joining me in this episode, two guests, Veenu and Ritul. Veenu till recently was working with the Development Monitoring and Evaluation Office at Niti Aayog, and there she handled a bunch of things, which also included the output-outcome framework. Ritul, again, not as much a guest. Ritul is my colleague at Takshila. And Ritul is building and nurturing the vibrant alumni network of Takshila. Before we start with the episode, I have a quick announcement. The admissions for Takshila's September 2022 GCPP cohort are open. If you apply before 23rd July, you can avail a 10% early bird scholarship. So what is this episode all about? Every now and then, there is a launch of a government scheme, policy. And whenever this happens, usually there is a huge focus on the scheme outlay. Not just during the launch of a scheme, but also during the presentation of the union budget, state budgets. There is always a conversation, or most of the conversations usually revolve around the finances that have been allocated to these schemes. Sometimes there is a conversation related to how much amount of money is being allocated to a particular sector, what has been the change as compared to the previous year, whether there has been a decrease, whether there has been an increase. So usually, the analysis of policies or the review of policies happens this way. And from this, maybe you have an idea whether a sector, a scheme, a policy has been prioritized. But this level of analysis might be useful to some extent, but it might have some limitations. So what are some of the ways by which we can do better analysis? Can we have better evaluation? Or is there a need for approaches for better policy evaluation? So, Veenu, since you have been working in this area, and Ritul, right, you have also been discussing these kind of things. What do you think?
Thank you for the welcome, Sarthak. I think it's fair enough for our guest to sort of take the center stage and talk about her experience and the work that she's done at the DMEO. To begin with, Veenu, I would ask you, could you take us through the history of policy evaluation in India? Like, when did it start? I know DMEO is a fairly new organization. It started in 2015. But were we doing monitoring and evaluation before this? Just like a brief history of how the landscape has been.
Yeah, thanks, Ritul. I think before we actually start, talking about the current M&E landscape, it's important to understand where all of the work that is happening currently at DMEO and Niti Aayog and generally in the M&E policy space in government, where it really originated. So just to give you a little background there, DMEO has been established by the Government of India back in September 2015. And as you very correctly mentioned and Sarthak also introduced, it is an attached office of the Niti Aayog. But earlier, this body, what is called the Program Evaluation Office and the Independent Evaluation Office were functioning, which were actually merged together in 2015. And that's when DMEO was born. So, the Program Evaluation Organization, this was established by the Government of India back in 1952. And the major mandate or the task that was allocated to the PEOs was to evaluate the community development programs and intensive area development schemes which were functioning under the Government of India and were funded by the government back then. So the PEOs, they worked as a division of the erstwhile Planning Commission. They had a very similar hierarchical structure. It was headed by an advisor who reported to the member of the Planning Commission, and these hierarchies still exist. So even currently, the DMEO is headed by what is now called the Director General. And the PEO earlier, they were actually, offices all across the country. It had 15 field units, which comprised of 7 regional offices and 8 project evaluation offices, which, as I mentioned, were located all across the country. So now, in an effort to accord more functional autonomy to the program evaluation mechanisms, the government actually also established an independent evaluation office in 2018. Then also the IEO was also headed by a director general who was equivalent to a union minister. And then when the present government came into the system in 2014, they said that, we can better utilize our human resources and our capacities in the PEOs and IEOs through a centralized unit which should be located in Delhi. And that's when the decision of merging PEOs and IEOs was taken and DMEO emerged as a result in 2015. That's very briefly the history of DMEO.
Yeah. So we know this is how the institution evolved. But if you look at the mandate of the institution, right, it is about monitoring different kinds of government interventions. Now, why monitoring plays a very important role? Why evaluation plays a very important role when it comes to public policy? What all can be done if you have some insights from that?
Right. So I think policy evaluation is fundamental to a sound public governance system, whether it be in LDCs or in advanced economies, in all kinds of economical structures, right? And it is concurrent monitoring and evaluation which actually helps the public system improve the kind of schemes they are running, the kind of policies that they're designing, and also how they're implementing it. And once they have a good picture of where the loopholes are and where there are scope for improvement, that in fact, and if those loopholes are of course filled, that leads to prosperity for the country and well-being of the citizens as a whole. So broadly, this is the overarching objective of why we should have a very strong monitoring and evaluation system for public policy in place. So it promotes so if I have to delineate and do a top down, sort of an analysis of why again this is important, then this also contributes to promoting public accountability, right? So
Yeah.
like you said, that the government of India spends X amount of money each year on a particular scheme. But how do I know if that program or that budget item or that expenditure from the government's kitty is actually bearing fruit or is achieving its objective? So for that, to answer that kind of question,
Yeah.
you need to have concurrent monitoring and and also process evaluation structures in place. And then this leads to more learning, increased public sector effectiveness, because then the process is improved, the implementation of the policy is improved. And of course, if you have to run similar programs in the future or continue a particular scheme, then you would know wherein there were faults in the policy design earlier, which you can fill up this time so that the policy is more effective going forward.
Yeah. So, I mean, since you're talking about monetary allocation and other things, right? One thing I wanted to add here, see, any policy that you are implementing, you will require different kinds of resources, right? It will be financial resources as well as different other resources. Now, whenever you are utilizing these resources, then we also have to keep in mind the opportunity cost for these things, right? So usually governments will have multiple things to do, or at least they will have multiple things that needs to be dealt with. And if they're going ahead with a particular policy intervention, which implies that some other things they're not able to take care of. Right? Let's say I have 10 rupees with me and I'm spending that on candy. That implies that I could have done something else with those 10 rupees, which I can't do.
Yeah.
So governments, whatever they are going ahead with, right, they will have huge opportunity cost. And it makes sense for us to evaluate so that so whether the government is getting, I mean, whatever outcomes are there, right, they are bang for the buck or not. This is also something that we need to think about, right? And evaluation is something which can help us identify that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So
just to chime in here, I think
go ahead.
it also sort of makes sense in a larger scheme of things that it sort of makes government accountable to the public, that whatever scheme they're running, is it even feasible? Is it delivering the intended outcome that it is supposed to? So, I mean, just on that note, for having followed DMEO's work, I think one of the key work that they've done is design the output outcome framework. Video, do you want to talk about it? What is it? What is the difference between output and outcome? How do you identify output outcomes for any expenditure? Just in brief, that what is this framework that you have designed?
Sure. So Output Outcome Monitoring Framework is actually one of the flagship products and publications of the Development Monitoring and Evaluation Office. And this document is prepared for most, actually 66 to be very precise, ministries and departments of the government of India, which involves more than 500 centrally sponsored and central sector interventions of the government. So under this framework, what we try to do is we list down, number one, all the schemes that the government is running, all the public interventions, and then we go back and study in depth all of these schemes. What are the objectives that they want to achieve? What is the kind of financial resources that the government is spending? And the basis and analysis, which I'll talk about later in our conversation, which is called the log frame approach, we delineate outputs and outcomes for each of these budget items or interventions. So we first prepare output and outcome statements, and then we frame indicators on each side, both for outputs and outcomes. Now, then, in coordination with central ministries and departments, we also seek targets along those indicators in order to effectively monitor all the public interventions. And these targets are supplied for the next financial year or the incoming financial year, because this whole output outcome monitoring framework, this is presented in parliament by the honorable finance minister in the budget session itself. So this oomph document is prepared for the incoming financial year, and then we monitor the targets which are given at the indicator level by the ministries and are decided in by DMEO in coordination with the concerned ministries. Those targets are broken down quarter wise. So for the next 4 quarters, we know what the ministry is targeting to achieve for all of the indicators. And then DMEO maintains a dashboard wherein all of these targets are monitored, and we seek updates from the ministries on a quarterly basis. This dashboard is fed by the staff which is sitting in ministries, and then the quarterly progress reports are made by DMEO, which is then also shared with concerned stakeholders. So just to give you a broad overview for the current financial year 22-23, DMEO prepared this document, which was presented in Parliament earlier this year. We have covered 67 ministry departments in this. More than 500 schemes have been covered, as I said. And if you look at the coverage of schemes which are there in budget this year, then we are covering 14 lakh crore of budget outlay. So in effect, we are actually monitoring 14 lakh crore worth of budget of the government of India under this document using the indicators that I talked about.
Yeah. So, just slightly zooming out, this document is called the Output Outcome Framework, right? But yeah, it will be great if you could just give us an example of what is an output, what is an outcome, or
Yes.
how output and outcome, how they differ from one another. I'm assuming that whatever financial outlay is there, that is an input, right? And
Yeah.
it will lead to something, and there will be a process which will create outputs, and then there will be outcome over a period of time. So just can you give me an example, give us some example or the difference between these things?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a very, fundamental question, because oftentimes we struggle with delineating indicators, whether it's an output or an outcome or even an impact level indicator. But I think understanding these basic terms is extremely important. So output is the first level of results, which need to occur in order to achieve the anticipated outcome.
Yeah.
Right. So this is more of a direct, tangible result of activities which we are performing within a particular scheme or a project, or and which will in fact be activities in that whole intervention. So in simple terms, it's a numerical count of a program's actions or products that were created or delivered. So if I have to take an example, say the number of people served and the activities or the services which were provided. And output, I would say, is typically easy to measure. It is readily determined. And for instance, one of the outputs for, say, a disaster relief program, it could be number of packets which were distributed to flood victims, right? And then for this, you would have a particular numerical target for that intervention, basis which you can ask your stakeholders to report progress data on that. While on the other hand, outcomes are more of like medium term effects, which is a precondition to accomplish your longer term goal or objective, which is going to be the impact of that particular program. So outcomes are more of a set of, I would say, changes for the population served, anticipated changes in terms of knowledge, in terms of skills, attitudes. And now this term has become very famous. So in terms of also behavior, right? And outcomes it's measurable, it is also time bound, and it is mostly qualitative in nature.
Okay. Okay.
So it may sometimes take a while to determine its full impact and also attribute the change. So for example, again, if I have to take the example of the disaster relief program, one of the outcomes could be how many flood victims have actually survived or
Hmm.
are less likely to starve because you ran a particular intervention. That
Hmm.
could be one of the outcomes.
Okay. So, one parallel example I can think of, let's say in the education sector, right? So, input is basically how much money you are spending in the education sector. Output can be, let's say, increase in enrollment, cross enrollment rates among children. And again, outcomes can be those learning outcomes, how whether students are able to learn things, how many of the students in, let's say, fourth standard are able to do second standard
Yeah.
sums. Yeah. So I think that's what is output and outcome, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure that, I mean, it might be we are giving examples which sounds easy, but identifying output outcomes must definitely be difficult, and there must be some ways by which you identify this, or there are ways by which an output is, I mean, can be identified from an outcome, and there will be some challenges in that. What we'll do is we'll discuss this, but we'll have a short break before that. Once we are back, we'll talk about the challenges in identifying outputs outcomes for different policies.
Actually, thank you, Sarthak, for that question. And I was thinking about the challenges, and one of the things that I can think through is that this seems to be a calendar year approach towards where you define output outcome measure against certain benchmark that you've decided. Now, this is to Veenu that what happens that, let's say, in the case of when you're making investments in something in human resource capacity building, because the investment that the government makes, but the benefit is accrued usually in future years. So HRD may be the first. So like when you're actually sort of rationalizing schemes, they must be the first to go for budget cuts because they're actually not meeting the targets. But then the flip side is that this is an investment in long term. Like I'm sure there are many challenges similar to this in terms of evaluating schemes. How does this whole scenario look like?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ritul. I think very important and hard to answer question, I would say. But yes, you're absolutely right. You know, things which are long term, of course, have a lot of issues when it comes to delineating outputs and outcomes. But we also need to realize that, why is the government even spending in the first place on things because there is a market failure, right? Because there's going to be some issue wherein the private sector will not come or will not have the ability to invest, and therefore the government needs to invest. So other than that, I would say, and when that's the case, and the government is in fact spending quite a lot for basic necessities of citizens, then it needs to make sure that there is good accountability and the kind of expenditure that they're doing is worthwhile. So when it comes to like schemes in the education sector, you're absolutely right that these are things which the fruits of which the government or we as a nation will reap in the long term. So then that would be counted as an impact, right? And there's also one very good project that DMEO is doing, and hopefully it should work. Is that we are trying to build a time series of the output outcome data that we are collecting. So this exercise started in 2017. We have data for about, say, 5 years now. And then out of which, although even if I take quarterly figures, then it's going to be about 20 data points I have for each of the schemes. And again, there would be loopholes in there also because the indicators have changed over time. And why? So I'm talking about this because that will give you an impact. So if I had an impact or an outcome level indicator back in 2017 for a particular education scheme, I will be able to observe the change on an yearly basis and calculate the CAGR over the 5-year period. And once I get more data points in the coming years, that will give me a very comprehensive picture of the impact that the government is trying to make through an intervention, say in the health sector or in the education sector, where most of the budget line items and the schemes have a long term, view. But it's
Yeah.
hard. It's hard, certainly hard, yes.
Yeah. And so we know, apart from this part, any other challenges you have when it comes to identifying output outcomes? And also, what is the method you usually use?
Right. So I think I'll answer the method question first. Basically, so the approach that we adopt to frame the indicators for any of the schemes, we base them on basis of three principles: relevance, exhaustiveness, and accuracy. It is, we have to make sure that the indicators that we are framing or deciding on, they are relevant to the particular scheme. That is, they have to be a part of the scheme design and the scheme's objectives. When I say exhaustiveness, I mean that the indicators have to be exhaustive in covering the various aspects of the implementation process, right? And also the intended objectives again. And it should also accurately represent the outputs and the outcomes. So that is basically the three principles very quickly. And the first step that we follow in the whole process is to begin by an in-depth study of the scheme guidelines, which are given in, EFC or SFC memorandums. And now some of these documents are freely available online as well. So these are basically the design documents for all public interventions. And based on this, then we take subsequent steps. So the suggested approach is generally divided into two steps: delineating your outputs and the outcome statements, and then defining the indicators. So, to delineate the scheme outputs from outcomes, it is recommended that we think about certain questions in sequence. Like, for example, for a scheme, what are the key target groups, right?
Hmm.
What performance improvements are we expecting for this target group?
Hmm.
This is for outputs. Then, for outcomes, what is it that the proposed intervention intends to bring about in the above performance improvements? So, in simple terms, what are the key constraints or to the improved performance of the group? Then, how is this intervention aiming to resolve the factors which limit the target groups? What are the root causes behind key constraints? And what are the activities that are proposed?
Hmm.
So, these are the basic questions that we try to answer. And once these questions are answered across different levels, then we form what is called the logical framework. So, logical framework is nothing but just starting from the bottom to first delineate the inputs, then the activities, then the outputs, the outcomes, and finally the impacts. And to delineate all of these, we answer the questions that I just talked about.
Okay.
But sorry.
Yeah. So yeah, what I can observe here is you create these indicators, right, for each of them.
Yeah.
And to evaluate that, you also need to have enough data. In
Yeah.
fact, for creating this also, you might require some amount of data, right? So you just cannot create these indicators in the vacuum. Maybe you will be looking at some data points from the past. So the question that I had is, do we have enough data for all these things? Do we have proper mechanism for gathering data for all these schemes and policies?
Yeah. So primarily, if I have to look at OOMF, I also want to, before I answer this question, and this is linked. So now, if you see the guideline documents of the Government of India, the scheme guideline documents, you will find a basic output outcome monitoring framework attached in all of these documents, and which was a major win for the Development Monitoring and Evaluation Office, because we were able to successfully convince the various stakeholders involved of the fact that this process has to be institutionalized in the process of appraisal of a scheme. So in all appraisal documents, you will find an embedded OOMF now attached, which is great. So which also means that once a ministry or a department is putting those indicators in the EFC or the SFC or the appraisal documents, then that means it has some mechanism to collect data on those indicators, right? Otherwise, they will not put those indicators and then say, oh, you know what, we do not have the mechanism or we do not have the M&E a data system in place to actually report progress on such indicators. So that is one. But on the other hand, I do also want to, share that there are certainly major data issues still. A lot of our processes of scheme implementation are still not digitized, which means that even for OOMF, we do face issues in collection of performance data. So even if I push the ministry or department to agree that we should have a very basic output indicator in place, but then we receive requests to drop those indicators or come up with a parallel indicator because the ministry does not collect or does not have a system in place to monitor or collect data for that previous indicator, which is more smart, right? Relevant, accurate, etc. So yes, there are linkages. And then we also try to, form indicators and pick up indicators from the dashboards which are available in public domain, which the ministries maintain. We had also proposed that our own OOMF dashboard, which DMEO maintains, should have API linkages with each of the dashboards which the ministry is maintaining. Because, we need to realize that this exercise is also a huge, huge burden on part of the ministries, and nobody likes to report, right? Nobody likes to.
Unfortunate thing. Yeah.
Yes. So that also is a huge burden on part of the ministries, and they need to manually enter data first in
Okay.
their internal dashboards,
Huh.
then on the OOMF also, then at
Hmm.
least 10 other reporting dashboards which the government of India maintains at different levels. So yes, data is an issue, but I think we also need to recognize that DMEO, whether it's MOSPI
Hmm.
and other stakeholders, which Mighty, I would say, is taking very good steps in
Hmm.
order to collect quality data. And if you look at some of the steps which have been taken under the DGQI exercise, the Data Governance Quality Index exercise, which also is a brainchild of the team at DMEO. I think it's a fantastic initiative of improving and also measuring the quality of data that is collected at the ministry and department level, at the schematic level of the government of India. And even under this exercise, a very important initiative is also being undertaken, wherein we are trying to revive the economical and statistical units. So, to our very surprise, I don't think a lot of people know, but each
Hmm.
of these ministries and departments in the center have a dedicated economic and statistical units, or verticals as they call it, or wings. But, due to capacity issues, most of these are non-functional or don't do the kind of rigorous and analytical work that they should with reported data. So under the DGQI exercise, this is also one of the parallel
Exactly.
objective, I would say, which is great, I think. Yeah.
Veenu, could you help me understand that are there countries at similar per capita level or similar level of development who have sort of excelled or are carrying monitoring and evaluation exercises in I have actually used this as a key component to deliver on public public services. As a matter of fact, I know about Mexico and Chile, where governments have adopted cost-effective evaluation products. I say cost-effective because I understand that this is expensive. It is not easy. So for a
Yeah.
developing country, it's not something which is easy. So Mexico and Chile have both done it with shorter timelines to assess program level performance. In fact, Mexico, Chile, Indonesia, South Africa have made excellent use of evaluation to improve their policy effectiveness. As far as I can remember, Mexico's national evaluation system, which is the Carnival, established
Yeah.
in 2005, it's dubbed as one of the world's best and has been replicated across the world. So, like a line or two about are other countries doing it and how are they doing it?
Yeah, certainly. So you're very right. Mexico is cited as the prime example when it comes to M&E ecosystems across the world, and especially in the public sector. They, of course, flourish because there's an institutional mandate in the country, and it originated back in 70s. The whole M&E system there, and it really transformed from an ad hoc sector specific approach to a more of a comprehensive nation-wide approach, which I think is great. But from a more micro perspective, if you look at some of the recent publications of Coneval, which is their prime M&E body in Mexico, you will find that they do a lot of short M&E policy briefs, which is great. Why? Because typically in the policy space, you realize that the decision makers or the policy makers, they don't have time. They cannot wait for 6 months or a year for evaluation results and recommendations to come in, right? So this is also a field which is extremely time sensitive.
Yeah.
So doing short, quick assessments, desk research, policy notes, basis, secondary data, and of course, building something out of data which is freely available, or if the government administrative data, I think is a very powerful tool. And we at Niti also are, we do absolutely realize its potential, but I don't think we in India have actually used administrative data to its full potential. So these are all of the things that we should be using. And I think Konival has used fantastically in order to push this evidence-based decision-making agenda in their country. But other countries also, like, for example, Australia. And Australian model is kind of different from Mexico. It is more decentralized, and it also has a more checkered history. So M&E in Australia actually originated in the 80s, which was a period of slowdown for them. And therefore, there was also a reduction in government expenditure back in Australia. So the incoming government, it actually increased its focus on rationalizing the expenditure and maximizing their own value for money. And this led to a series of micro reforms and formally introduced the M&E techniques in
Okay.
governance. And then, then in the 90s or the late 80s was considered the most successful phase in this model. Then 10 years down the line, they actually formed the outputs outcomes framework, very similar to ours, to report service delivery indicators by each of the departments. Presently, it remains devolved, and they give priority to M&E across departments, which is differing. So even in terms of capacity, even in terms of importance, it differs. Yeah, and other examples include Canada, Chile, South Africa.
Veenu, since we are at the end of it, I want to know about what the way forward for monitoring and evaluation looks like in India. And I have some questions to you in that regard. That has it been replicated at the state level in India? Because I know it is done at the national level, but has it been replicated at the state level? Two, what is being done to institutionalize monitoring and evaluation in public policy? And when I went to the DMEO website, I saw that there are trainings for senior government officials, etc., to build capacity so that more ministries are equipped with this. Just these things. And to close it off for our readers, Niti Aayog DMEO does a newsletter which is Vikas Patra. So for policy nerds who want to follow up on what is being done at DMEO, I think that is a good resource, which is where most of my learning came from. Just one line response on all of these.
Sure. So on the subnational M&E ecosystem, yes, we do have certain state governments which have taken a lead when it comes to M&E, whether it's Karnataka, whether it's Tamil Nadu, who have very strong, M&E systems in place. Andhra also, and they have full-fledged M&E bodies with staff who are, who have the primary mandate to do this. They have also institutionalized it, which means that for the next budget cycle, if a particular scheme has to continue, then it has to undergo evaluation, which is very similar to the mandate even at the center.
Yeah.
So yes, there are states. Haryana also has adopted the OOMF framework, the output outcome framework, which is great. GNK and some of the northeast states, including Nagaland, Assam, DMEO is working with them, including Madhya Pradesh, to come up with such frameworks in the future. So yes,
And
there
I
are
wanted to
states.
add one thing. Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing here. This particular thing is very important when it comes to the state governments, because in case of India, more than 60% of the public expenditure happens at the state level.
Yeah.
And many of the things that directly impact us, right, they are within the state's jurisdiction, health, education, and usually the states will be providing for most of the services, right?
Yeah.
So, if the states have this framework, then it is better because, it's eventually directly going to impact people's lives.
Yeah.
As one of the professor I was PAing under used to say that state is where the action is. So I think what Sarthak says makes all the sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think your second question was on institutionalization. So I think for M&E, we have a long way to go when it comes to institutionalization. Some of the prime examples that I talked about, like Andhra, they have a clear mandate to evaluate and also monitor some of their public budgetary interventions. But, for this kind of system to really work, you need financial teeth. So if you look at the budget for M&E in India, it's just marginal. So I think at the center and also at the state level, the concerned, whether it's planning departments or the financial departments, they need to work and collaborate to get this institutionalized, to make sure that, number one, there is a good budget, enough budget to do M&E at the subnational and the national level, and also link the performance of the scheme to budgets, which is very, very important, I think. So we have taken steps at the center and state both, I would say, but we do have a lot of work to be done still.
Yeah, I have to add one more thing to this. So you also need to have a body which has that kind of an independence, right? So some countries, they have something called as a Fiscal Council. It's an independent body which is most likely reporting to their legislature, and it can basically decide what should be the policy priorities, and accordingly schemes can be formulated, implemented, and then it also monitors, right, where you are, whether you have been able to meet those outputs and outcomes. But it again needs that kind of an independence. which again we don't have such kind of an institutional framework right now, I guess.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ritul, I forgot your third question. What was it?
I think it's okay. We're already run out of time. Thank you so much, Veenu. It was fascinating to have you, and I'm sure both our listeners and me and Sarthak learned a lot from you. And thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was a great experience. And I, in fact, learned a lot from both of you during this conversation and also a briefing yesterday. So thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thanks to the listeners. Thanks to Ritul. Thanks to Veenu. We'll meet again in one more episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.